The Honourable, resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It is an honour to rise in support of this important motion, but boy, do I wish we didn't have to. I wish this chamber didn't have to defend the work of the elected chamber in the face of the unelected senators that are trying to overrule this. And I should note, Madam Speaker, I'll be splitting my time with the member for Tobic-Mactaquac. Now, personally, I have been following Bill C-234 literally since its inception, as well as its predecessor Bill C-206. So I have a bit of a unique ability to provide a primer on what this bill does, why it matters, and how we got to the point of needing a motion in the House of Commons calling on the Senate to pass this bill. So at the farm level, a grain grower harvests his or her crop, and he can choose to sell it immediately to an elevator or store it in a bin, those bins you see lined up around farmyards all across the country. Storing grain costs money, but you have the benefit of being able to market it at a later date at hopefully higher prices. Now, all types of commodities must be stored in a specific manner, protecting the moisture level of that commodity to avoid spoiling, rotting, sprouting inside the bin, reducing or eliminating the value of the commodity in that bin. Now, if the moisture level is too high, they must use a grain dryer that's powered by propane or natural gas to produce the amount of heat at a consistent flow to make sure that they can have the quality maintained throughout those winter months. Now, Madam Speaker, these dryers are actually full of impressive technology to ensure maximum efficiency. Despite the carbon tax being added on, the cost of the fuel is already quite expensive on top of the cost of the dryer itself. And Madam Speaker, I've had the chance to tour Western grain dryers in my riding in Eli, Manitoba to see some of that technology firsthand. Farmers have been adopting these innovative technologies for years and years, and they should be applauded for it, not punished for it. There are only two fuel options available to a grain farmer. It's propane or natural gas. Despite what my colleagues across the way might live in some fantasy world where these new ways to heat a grain dryer, they don't exist at any scalable commercial level whatsoever. So all we're doing is punishing farmers for doing a practice that they need to do to maintain the quality of their grain. And livestock producers are in the exact same boat. They need to maintain temperatures inside their barns to protect the health and welfare of their animals, and they rely on the same heat sources. So what Bill C-234 would do would be to exempt farmers from paying the carbon tax on propane and natural gas when used on farm. That's it. That's all it does. It's a very narrow carve-out that will alleviate the cost for farmers and help make Canadians' food cheaper. But the Liberals have decided, bizarrely, that this is the hill that they're going to die on. This is the carbon tax sword that they are willing to fall on. And I can only assume it's because over the next 7 years, this would mean $1 billion being left in the pockets of our hard-working farmers. And they firmly believe that that's their money, that the government should be taking $1 billion out of our farmers' pockets to do whatever they think is going to save the planet or whatever that might be. It's common sense to take the tax off of these activities. But it's not just me, Madam Speaker, that's saying that this is a good idea. We've had 5 premiers write open letters to the Senate calling on them to pass this legislation. All major ag groups, including the Agricultural Carbon Alliance, which encompasses all major ag groups in Canada, are in strong support of this legislation. We have the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, have all offered their support to the Senate to pass this bill unamended because it makes sense for farmers and it makes sense for Canadians. Now, the carbon tax most definitely should and soon will be taken off all products in this country. But in the meantime, this is a pretty good place to start to help alleviate the cost of food for Canadians. Because right now we're forcing farmers to pay tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes to do what they absolutely need to do to produce our food, fuel, or fiber. Now, our farmers have an incredible sustainability track record, and we should be proud of it. They regularly invest in new technologies, in new equipment, and in new practices that make them more sustainable, that improve their sustainability profile. But the challenge is, when you take this much money out of their pockets, they are simply unable to reinvest that capital into their own operation. Instead of buying new equipment that can more precisely apply crop protection products, fertilizer, seed. They're forced to make a choice and say, we can't do this, despite that action being the best way for us to reduce emissions on farm. Madam Speaker, it's a prime example of when we talk about technology, not taxes, this is the difference. On the Conservative side, we believe that the technology that farmers will readily and happily invest in if the government isn't taking it out of their pocket will improve environmental outcomes at the individual farm level and therefore across the nation. And the government, the Liberal government, they say no. We'll tax them. Is the carbon tax working in this case? No. I don't care. Let's keep the taxes on because we need this revenue to fund our other pet projects. Now, this bill has been around since 2020. Previously, Bill C-206, now Bill C-234. And it's essentially the same bill. And it's maintained support from all opposition parties in this House. But the Liberals, they just refuse to give in. They refuse to be adaptive. They refuse to be reasonable and recognize when something isn't working, you should probably change it because it's just harming our farmers and Canadian consumers. So instead, we have this stubborn, worn-out government grappling with the political fallout of their decision to climb down from their carbon tax on home heating for 3% of Canadians in certain parts of the country while leaving the rest of Canadians out in the cold. And now they're trying to figure out how to grapple with what would be another carve-out. It's been quietly making its way through the elected chamber and onto the Senate, but all of a sudden it is a big problem for these Liberals. So now we have these Liberal ministers. The Minister of Environment even admitted in the media that he'd been calling senators. We have PMO staffers calling in favors to their Prime Minister, Liberal-appointed senators. And I am fed up with hearing members across the way repeatedly state that the Senate is independent. Nobody in this chamber, nobody in the press gallery, no political nerd, no casual observer of politics believes for a second that when just a couple of weeks ago you appointed a former Liberal MP that somehow the Senate is independent of this party. Just because they don't caucus together doesn't mean that it is an independent Senate. Our elected chamber has spoken. We've endorsed a common sense carve-out on the carbon tax for our farmers. But so what's happened in the Senate? All of a sudden, at the Agriculture and Forestry Committee, attention was far higher on this random PMB that's worked his way through. And it only enhanced after the Prime Minister decided to step back on the home heating carbon tax for certain Canadians. An amendment, many amendments were proposed, one of which, due to a tie, was passed. That was brought forward at report stage to the larger chamber. The Senate rightfully voted down that amendment, returning the legislation back to its original form where it should stay and where it should pass as is. And then somehow, out of the blue, at third reading in the Senate, the amendment that was already brought forward at that committee stage was tabled by a senator that seems to have no previous interaction with agriculture, no interaction with this committee, and it just magically appears. No connection to politics whatsoever. This couldn't be about the Liberal government's climb down on the carbon tax. Nobody believes that the Liberals aren't behind this. It just doesn't add up, and the fact that they continue to hide behind this is just embarrassing.
Absolutely.
The fake outrage we see during question period, during this debate, trying to keep a straight face when they say the Senate is independent, is just absurd. So that's where we are. The Senate, or more specifically, Liberal without title senators, are holding this bill hostage at the request of the Prime Minister. This elected chamber chose democratically to eliminate the carbon tax on our farmers, and the Senate is trying to overrule us. We shouldn't be here debating this motion today. The Senate should be doing the right thing. We should never have to spend a day in this chamber trying to tell the Senate to do the right thing. It's shameful that these Liberals are being so petty. The tactics that they're taking in the Senate are unheard of. Instead of being reasonable, the Liberals are just digging their heels in because they're worried about their own political fortunes if there's a second carbon tax carve-out. The Liberals need to realize that Canadians don't like the carbon tax. They don't see value in the carbon tax because life has become so unaffordable across every aspect of their lives. It's hard to justify seeing the government getting richer and Canadians getting poorer. But, Madam Speaker, I will wrap up by saying, in the upcoming carbon tax election, Canadians will have a choice between quadrupling the carbon tax or axing the carbon tax. But in the meantime, I implore my colleagues to support this motion, urging the Senate to do the right thing and pass Bill C-234 unamended to give our farmers a break and Canadian consumers a break on their food prices. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I would say to my colleague across the way that this has very little to do with the substance of the legislation. What it really has more to do with, I would suggest to the member opposite, is the intimidation tactics that are being used by the Conservative Party of Canada. You know, I see a disturbing pattern that's taking place that Canadians should be concerned about. That's right. I would call it the Donald Trump syndrome. And we are seeing that in by the leader of the Conservative Party today, Madam Speaker. It is very disturbing, and it is a pattern that we are starting to see more and more of. Yep. My question to the member is, does he believe it is appropriate to have intimidation and using intimidation of senators in order to push things through the Senate? Intimidation that makes some senators so scared that they're scared to go home, Madam Speaker, that they're telling their staff to stop answering the phone. That is serious stuff. It's the Donald Trump syndrome, and the Conservatives are falling for it. Does he disagree with the leader of the Conservative Party?
The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
The best way to know you're losing a debate is when you start flailing with ridiculous accusations. The fact of the matter is, nobody would ever support the harassment or threats towards any elected or unelected member of Parliament. But the fact that senators are for the first time facing thousands of letters that are facing
Deputy Government House Leader, that he doesn't have the floor and he should wait for questions and comments if he wishes to contribute to the conversation. The Honourable Member for Portage-Lisgar.
As I was saying, Madam Speaker, just because you are not accountable to anybody doesn't mean that you shouldn't expect in this public life to receive phone calls and letters. And maybe if you are, you should have a second thought about what you're doing and why nobody's calling you saying, hey, good job, we support you. But thousands of people are calling and saying, hey, pass this bill, get out of the way, stop playing politics. And that's what the Senate needs to do, and that's why we need to pass this motion.
Good job.
Yes, John.